The late afternoon sun dipped low over Baton Rouge, casting long golden shadows across the cracked sidewalks. Lieutenant Brianna Wells moved through the familiar streets with quiet confidence, an unspoken assurance that came from years of discipline, of knowing exactly who she was. Her dark brown eyes scanned the neighborhood, once so familiar, now a little more distant, like a childhood home left untouched for too long. It had been 7 years since Brianna had left, 7 years since she enlisted, and 7 years since she buried her mother. The streets hadn't changed much, if at all. The same convenience store stood on the corner, still advertising 2-for-1 sodas, its old neon sign flickering as it did all those years ago. The same barber shop had its faded sign hanging proudly, and the same basketball court, where kids played like their futures depended on every dribble and shot, had not lost its sense of purpose. The air smelled like fried catfish from Miss Laverne's restaurant, the same smell that always seemed to pull her back into memories she hadn't thought about in years. Brianna adjusted the duffel bag slung over her shoulder, her gait steady, almost mechanical. She wasn't wearing anything that screamed military, just a plain, fitted t-shirt, cargo pants, and worn sneakers. But even in civilian clothes, she carried herself differently. Her shoulders were squared, her chin level, her steps measured. It wasn't something she could turn off. Her father had once called it warrior posture. Brianna smiled faintly at the thought. He would have been proud of the woman she had become if he were still here. As she passed a group of teenage boys huddled outside a corner store, one of them, maybe 16, glanced up, did a double take, and nodded respectfully. "You military?" he asked. Brianna paused, meeting his gaze. "Something like that." The boy grinned. "I figured. My cousin's in the Army. He walks like you." Before Brianna could respond, one of his friends called him inside, and just like that, the moment passed. Brianna exhaled slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Moments like that reminded her why she fought, why she endured. She had spent years in places most people only saw on TV: Kandahar, Fallujah, Mogadishu. She had led teams through the dead of night, through chaos and enemy fire, through sandstorms that swallowed sound and light. And now here she was, walking through streets that felt both familiar and foreign. She had spent her 20s in war zones, her 30s trying to process the toll war had taken on her. But at 40, Brianna wasn't sure what home even meant anymore. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a patrol car creeping up beside her, its slow crawl out of place in a neighborhood where cops usually sped through without a second glance. Brianna kept walking, pretending not to notice, but she knew the drill. The window rolled down, and a gravelly voice called out, "Excuse me, miss." She stopped and turned slightly. A man in his 40s, Officer Chris McAllister, stared at her from behind a pair of mirrored sunglasses. His thick arms were crossed, and a smirk played on his lips, one that suggested he enjoyed this, whatever this was. "Mind telling me what you're doing around here?" he asked. Brianna studied him for a beat, her expression unreadable. She had encountered men like him before, men who saw a confident woman and mistook it for a challenge. "Just walking," she replied, her voice calm. McAllister's smirk faded just a little. "Where to?" Brianna arched a brow. "Didn't realize I needed an itinerary to walk down my own street." The officer's expression tightened. "We've had some break-ins around here. Gotta make sure everything's in order." Brianna's gaze never wavered. "You see me breaking into something?" A muscle in McAllister's jaw twitched. He leaned against the open window, exhaling sharply. "Just doing my job." Brianna exhaled through her nose, fighting the urge to roll her eyes. "Well, I'm just walking." But McAllister wasn't done. He shifted in his seat, his tone hardening. "Hold on a second. Let's see some ID." Brianna didn't move. She had been trained to assess threats, surroundings, exits, and the person in front of her. Right now, she wasn't just assessing a man in uniform. She was assessing a man who was getting too comfortable pushing his authority, and she already knew one thing. This wasn't going to end quietly. The tension in the air was palpable as Brianna stood still, not moving an inch. She could feel Officer McAllister's gaze boring into her, trying to intimidate her, but it didn't work. She had been through worse, far worse, than some small-town cop trying to throw his weight around. Brianna's calm demeanor was deliberate, controlled. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of being rattled. McAllister's hand hovered near his seatbelt as he continued to eye her. "You're not from around here, are you?" His voice had shifted, becoming more accusatory than before. He clearly didn't believe she belonged in this neighborhood. Brianna didn't flinch. "I live here," she replied flatly. The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared at her, as if waiting for her to crack. He seemed to be trying to decide if she was really who she said she was. But Brianna didn't offer any further information. She wasn't here to explain herself to anyone, least of all to him. McAllister's jaw tightened. "I've been patrolling this area for years. Never seen you before." Brianna tilted her head slightly. "Maybe you missed me." A quick flash of frustration passed across his face, and he leaned forward, making his presence more imposing. "Look, lady, I don't know who you think you are, but I'm just doing my job. We've had some break-ins around here, and I need to make sure you're not up to anything." "Up to anything?" Brianna asked, her voice low and steady. "You have no reason to think I'm up to anything." McAllister's hand dropped to his side, and she saw the small movement, his fingers twitching as if to grab something, maybe his gun or his radio. Brianna knew that movement, recognized the subtle signs of a man trying to reclaim control of a situation that had slipped from his grasp. But she wasn't going to let that happen. "I'm just walking, officer," Brianna said again, this time her tone more measured. "And I've done nothing wrong." McAllister's eyes narrowed. "Then let me see your ID." Brianna's gaze didn't falter. She reached into her pocket slowly, her fingers brushing the military ID she carried for moments like this. The officers in her line of work weren't always fond of military personnel walking through their jurisdictions. But Brianna didn't care. She wasn't here to make friends. With a single motion, she pulled out her ID and held it up between them, not offering it over, just showing it, as if daring him to challenge her. McAllister took the ID, inspecting it with exaggerated slowness. "Navy SEAL, huh?" He read the words aloud as if trying to mock her. "Is this real, or are you just playing dress up?" Brianna held his gaze without flinching, the disdain in her expression clear. "You can check it. Call it in if you need to." The officer's lip curled and his voice dropped into a mocking tone. "Navy SEAL, that's cute, but you're not the first one to pull a fast one. How do I know this is legit?" The crowd around them was starting to grow, their murmurs building with every second. Brianna could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their judgment shifting in her favor. She remained calm, but inside she was beginning to read the signs. The way McAllister was holding the ID, the way his stance had subtly shifted. He wasn't just trying to verify her identity anymore. He was trying to dominate her, to prove something, and it wasn't going to happen. "Run it through your system," Brianna said flatly. "You'll find out soon enough." McAllister looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and irritation. He wasn't used to women standing their ground, let alone a woman who didn't cower in the face of his authority. His eyes flicked over to the crowd, now clearly paying attention. People had their phones out, recording. Brianna could see the young woman from earlier, standing at the edge of the sidewalk, phone raised high. The crowd was no longer just watching, it was a witness to this moment. "Back up, huh?" McAllister muttered under his breath. His fingers danced toward his radio, but Brianna saw it before he made the call. This was no longer just about her ID. It was about power, and McAllister wasn't prepared to lose that. "You want backup for what?" Brianna asked, her tone calm, but laced with the sharp edge of a woman who had been through far worse situations and knew how to handle them. "Because I'm not the problem here." The officer paused, his fingers hovering over the radio. For the first time since their interaction began, there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He hadn't expected this kind of resistance. He had expected compliance, submission. What he was getting was something else entirely. A woman who refused to back down, who refused to shrink in the face of authority. "Back up for an uncooperative suspect," McAllister said, his voice tight. But there was a hesitation now, a crack in his confidence. Brianna could hear the murmurs from the crowd, people beginning to voice their disbelief. Brianna raised an eyebrow. "Uncooperative? You're the one who stopped me for no reason." The crowd's whispers grew louder now. Some of them, Brianna noticed, were starting to shake their heads, some even speaking up. The balance of power was shifting, and McAllister could feel it. He wasn't in control anymore. The situation was thickening, the air charged with anticipation. Officer Chris McAllister's posture had shifted, and Brianna could feel his frustration radiating in waves. The once casual interaction had become something far more intense. It wasn't just about her walking down the street anymore. It was about power, it was about control, and McAllister wasn't the one in control. A few more people had stopped, drawn in by the standoff. Brianna caught sight of a man across the street, standing by a food truck, arms folded, his gaze locked on the scene unfolding. The young woman who had been recording earlier had moved a bit closer, her phone still held high, capturing every moment. McAllister's fingers flexed around Brianna's ID as though he were trying to find a way to twist this situation into something more fitting for him. He knew this wasn't right. He could feel the weight of the crowd watching, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. The problem with men like McAllister was that they thought they could control any situation just by wielding their badge. And right now, Brianna wasn't cooperating with that narrative. He exhaled sharply and tightened his grip on her ID. "You sure this isn't a fake?" he asked, voice laced with condescension. Brianna stood there, completely unmoved. "Run it through your system. You'll know it's real." She said the words calmly, her tone devoid of emotion. The ID wasn't the issue. This was something else, something personal. McAllister wasn't just questioning her identity. He was questioning her right to be here, in this neighborhood, on this street. He flicked the ID back and forth, eyes scanning it like he could somehow uncover a flaw, but nothing. He was desperate for a reason to assert himself, to bring Brianna down a peg, but all he was doing was digging his hole deeper. His words, aimed to belittle, only made him appear more foolish. "You really expect me to believe you've been out there fighting for this country?" McAllister scoffed, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Navy SEAL? Please, a woman like you." The insult stung, but Brianna didn't let it show. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned her service, her capabilities, or her very identity. She had learned long ago that it didn't matter what others thought of her. It only mattered what she thought of herself. Instead of responding, Brianna simply stared at him, silent. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of an angry outburst. She wasn't going to let him see how much his words got under her skin. The young woman with the phone was still recording, and Brianna noticed a few others had begun to do the same. McAllister was becoming more aware of the growing audience, his smirk slipping away as he shifted nervously. The crowd was a tangible presence now, an ever-watchful witness to his every move. And the power he had once tried to assert over Brianna was beginning to slip from his fingers, replaced by something more uncomfortable: vulnerability. Brianna's eyes darted to the people around her, noting the quiet shift in the crowd's mood. Some had started to murmur to each other, their voices low but steady. She could feel it, the change. The energy that had been with McAllister was now directed at him. McAllister could feel it too. His body stiffened, his jaw clenched tighter, but his eyes kept darting around, searching for some way to regain the upper hand. This wasn't the kind of situation he was used to. He dealt with uncooperative suspects before, but he wasn't used to encountering someone who stood their ground so firmly, especially not someone who didn't shrink in the face of his authority. With a sharp, frustrated breath, McAllister's hand moved toward his belt. Brianna's senses went on high alert. She watched his every movement, the subtle shift in his stance, the tightening of his fingers as he reached for his cuffs. The crowd was watching now, silent but anticipating. Brianna's training kicked in. Her body became poised, ready. She didn't take a step back. She didn't flinch. If McAllister made the wrong move, she would be ready. The crowd could feel the tension too, and their phones were still recording. "Back up," McAllister grunted, almost under his breath, as his fingers hovered near his radio. "I'm going to need backup for this one." Brianna saw right through it. Backup for what? For refusing to hand over my ID? For walking down my own street? The audacity of his words seemed to hit him just as hard as it hit her. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His eyes flicked toward the people filming, then back to her, and for the first time, Brianna saw doubt in his eyes. He wasn't the one in control anymore. The crowd was turning on him, and he knew it. They saw through him. A few people had started to mutter under their breath, comments about the situation being unnecessary, about how this wasn't right. Some voices were louder now. "You gonna keep making a scene?" One man called out from the corner store. "She didn't do anything wrong." Another woman chimed in, "Just let her go." But McAllister wasn't listening. His ego had already been bruised, and he wasn't going to let it go that easily. He was still holding on to the last bit of power he thought he had over Brianna. He thought she would back down, give him the respect he believed he deserved. But Brianna wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. The atmosphere had shifted. What began as a routine stop was now an open confrontation, a showdown not just between Brianna Wells and Officer Chris McAllister, but between authority and resistance, between pride and humility. The crowd had become more than just passive observers. They had become witnesses to something unfolding right in front of them. McAllister was becoming desperate. His fingers twitched near his belt, hovering above his cuffs, his body stiff with frustration. Brianna's eyes never left him, her expression calm, but inside she was calculating, assessing the moment with military precision. She wasn't going to let him escalate things. She wasn't going to let him turn this into something ugly. He reached for his cuffs. The moment his fingers brushed the cold metal of the handcuffs, Brianna's instincts kicked in. It was all too familiar to her. The sudden shift in his stance, the tightening of his grip, the subtle move to assert control over her. He wasn't prepared for what was coming next. With a speed that was almost imperceptible, Brianna stepped back and pivoted just enough to break his grip before it could even fully form. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't aggression. It was control. Control of herself. Control of the situation. The way she moved was fluid, efficient, almost surgical. McAllister's eyes flickered with surprise. He hadn't expected her to move so quickly, so seamlessly. He tried to grab her again, but Brianna was already out of his reach, her posture still unwavering, her presence still undeniable. She hadn't even broken a sweat, and yet in that moment, he had been completely undone. The crowd gasped. A few people murmured under their breath, and Brianna could feel the shift in their energy. The tension that had been swirling around McAllister now clung to him like a heavy weight. People weren't just watching anymore. They were seeing what was happening. They were witnessing McAllister's loss of control, and it was happening in front of their very eyes. One man across the street, who had been watching quietly up until now, chuckled under his breath. "Damn, did she just slip out of his grip?" The woman recording on her phone zoomed in, her smile growing as she captured every second of McAllister's humiliation. Brianna stood perfectly still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing even. She wasn't going to escalate things. She wasn't going to give McAllister a reason to feel more threatened than he already did. But she wasn't about to let him control her either. The officer, flustered and embarrassed, had taken a step back. His face had flushed, the realization setting in that he had underestimated her, that he had allowed his pride to blind him to the fact that Brianna was not someone to be easily intimidated. The crowd was no longer just passive. They were an active part of the moment. Their eyes were trained on McAllister, waiting to see how he would respond. "Did you just assault me?" McAllister spat, his voice rising with frustration. He was grasping for something, anything, to regain the upper hand. But the words felt hollow. It wasn't assault. It was a simple move to avoid unnecessary contact. He had made the first aggressive gesture, and Brianna had done nothing more than avoid it. Brianna's response was measured, calm, and sharp. Number Y avoided unnecessary contact. McAllister's chest heaved with each breath, his anger building. The situation was slipping further from his control, and he wasn't about to admit defeat. He was used to being the one with the power, the one who could dictate the terms of any interaction. But Brianna had flipped the dynamic, and now he was the one under the microscope. The eyes of the crowd were on him, and they weren't looking at him with respect. The woman with the phone spoke up again, louder this time. "Uncooperative?" He's the one acting all aggressive. Someone else from the crowd called out, "She didn't touch him, man. He's the one messing up." McAllister's face reddened further as his frustration boiled over. His fingers twitched near his radio, but his movements were slow, hesitant. The crowd was starting to voice their opinions more freely now. They had seen McAllister's attempt at intimidation, and they weren't having it. The officer glanced around, clearly realizing that any attempt to escalate further would backfire. The weight of the situation had shifted. He wasn't in control of this moment anymore. His pride, his authority, it was all crumbling in front of the very people he had tried to command. "You got a problem, sir?" Brianna asked, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. She wasn't backing down, but she wasn't being aggressive either. Her posture remained steady, her words calm but firm. McAllister opened his mouth as if to respond, but nothing came out. For a split second, the entire street seemed to hold its breath. The dynamic between the officer and Brianna had changed irrevocably. The crowd was no longer just watching, they were part of the story now, and the power had shifted. Brianna stood tall, and McAllister was left fumbling for something to salvage his dignity. It was then that he made the mistake of stepping closer. Just an inch, but it was enough. He had miscalculated. Brianna saw it coming, and without hesitation, she reacted. Her foot shifted, her body moving just enough to redirect him. She didn't need to attack him. All she had to do was take a step to the side. The result was instantaneous. McAllister lost his balance. His body shifted, his feet stumbled, and for a brief, fleeting moment, he looked ridiculous. Clumsy, uncoordinated, caught in the act of losing control. The gasps from the crowd confirmed it. The woman recording grinned wider, capturing the entire moment. Brianna let him regain his footing, but she didn't take her eyes off him. Her presence alone was enough to keep him off balance. She wasn't just standing her ground. She was demonstrating the simple fact that power, real power, wasn't always about force. It was about control. Control of oneself, control of the moment, control of the narrative. The crowd was still buzzing, their whispers filling the air as Brianna stood there, calm and composed, while McAllister tried to regain his footing. She could see the humiliation in his eyes now. The pride he had once tried to assert was gone, shattered in front of everyone. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected a woman to stand up to him like this, not without flinching. But here she was, unshaken, unbroken. "Are we done here?" Brianna asked, her voice steady, her eyes still locked on McAllister. There was no anger in her voice, no frustration, just quiet control. McAllister's chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, but he didn't answer her. His hands were clenched into fists, his face a mask of humiliation. He had no words left. His authority had been completely dismantled in front of the crowd, and he knew it. Before he could make another move, a second patrol car pulled up with a smooth, practiced turn. Sergeant Max Donovan stepped out, his sharp blue eyes scanning the scene immediately. He took in the situation with a quick glance. McAllister, visibly rattled and still holding Brianna's military ID in his hand, and Brianna herself, standing tall, the picture of calm composure. Donovan's experience told him everything he needed to know. He exhaled slowly and turned to McAllister. "First Officer McAllister, explain to me what's going on here." McAllister opened his mouth but then hesitated, his gaze flicking to the phones pointed at him from every direction. He knew better than to lie in front of a crowd this large, especially with the evidence recording everything. "She resisted, wouldn't give her ID," McAllister finally muttered, his voice low, strained. "Got aggressive." The young woman with the phone immediately called out, "That's a lie, and we all saw it." Donovan's eyes flicked over to Brianna, his expression softening slightly. He wasn't buying McAllister's version of the story. "Lieutenant Wells," he said, his voice respectful but firm, "is that what happened?" Brianna didn't rush her answer. She let the moment linger before speaking. "He stopped me for no reason. I gave him my ID when he asked. Then he accused me of lying about who I am." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "When he tried to put cuffs on me for no reason, I stopped him." Donovan processed the information, his eyes narrowing slightly as he turned to McAllister. There was no denying it now. The crowd had witnessed everything, and McAllister's actions had been clear. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The weight of the public's gaze was no longer on Brianna. It was on him. "McAllister," Donovan said, his voice cool, "you're relieved of duty." Effective immediately. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. McAllister's face drained of color, and for a brief moment, he stood frozen, a man who had lost everything. His pride, his authority, everything. He looked at Brianna one last time, but there were no words left. The crowd reacted in hushed disbelief, the murmurs growing louder, some even applauding quietly. The young woman with the phone had captured every moment of McAllister's downfall, and she gave Brianna an approving smile. Donovan turned back to Brianna, his voice softer now. "Lieutenant Wells, do you wish to press charges?" Brianna didn't hesitate. "No." Her answer was simple, but it held weight. "I didn't come back home looking for a fight. I just wanted to walk down my street." Donovan nodded, understanding. He wasn't going to press her further. McAllister's fate had already been sealed by his own actions, and Brianna had handled the situation with remarkable composure. Donovan looked at McAllister one last time, a clear message in his eyes. "You'll be reviewed. There's no coming back from this. Not here. Not now." Brianna turned away, her gaze steady and purposeful. She didn't look back at McAllister or the crowd. She didn't need to. The victory had already been won. As she walked down the street, her steps measured and deliberate. She could feel the eyes of the crowd still on her, but she wasn't shaken. She wasn't looking for applause. She wasn't looking for validation. She was just walking. Walking in a world that had, for too long, tried to make her shrink. But today she had stood tall. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Pick your fights. Win the ones that matter." This fight had mattered.